Have you ever felt that after a spiritual awakening, everything became strangely silent? As if life, which once propelled you with goals, desires, and plans, suddenly lost its color. You broke through illusions, saw clearly what was once hidden. But now, what you feel is an unsettling emptiness, a lack of motivation no one warned you about. This video is for those who've crossed the great revelation and, instead of finding strength, found silence. What if I told you this lack of drive isn't weakness, but an essential part of the process? Spiritual awakening is often romanticized as a destination, as if, by piercing the veil of illusion, everything becomes clear, vibrant, full of purpose. But the truth is harsher, and at the same time, more sacred. For many, awakening doesn't ignite a flame, it extinguishes the old fire. The motivation that once drove you, rooted in desires, validation, and achievements, crumbles. And in its place arises something few know how to name. A raw, empty, disorienting space. It's not depression, nor apathy. It's the collapse of the old reasons for existing. In this video, we'll journey together through this shadowy and sacred territory, understanding why, after a spiritual awakening, we lose the motivation that once propelled us. We'll reveal that this state, though painful, isn't the end, but an inevitable transitional stage. It's the exact point where the ego dies, but the self hasn't yet fully emerged. And more importantly, we'll learn how to inhabit this emptiness with courage and presence until a new strength, truer and more aligned, begins to rise. So, take a deep breath and stay until the end, because here we won't offer shortcuts or empty motivational slogans. We'll talk about what few dare to admit, that true spiritual awakening, before it illuminates, dismantles, before it empowers, it empties. But it's in this emptying that the new you begins to take shape. And if this video resonates with you, write in the comments, "I'm ready to cross the void." That's the first step of the journey. Little is said about it, but the collapse that follows a spiritual awakening is as real as it is invisible. There are no grand external explosions or dramatic changes for those watching from the outside, but within, everything falls apart. What once motivated you, the desire to be someone, to achieve, to be recognized, suddenly loses meaning. It's as if, by crossing the threshold of illusion, you realized you were chasing ghosts. And then, without warning, the force that once moved you dissolves like smoke in the air. This collapse doesn't come as punishment, but as a natural consequence of spiritual vision. When you see that much of what drove you was fueled by insecurities, fears, and an endless need for external validation, the energy sustaining those pursuits simply finds no reason to exist anymore. Awakening severs the roots of artificial motivations, and for a time, there's nothing in their place. Just an empty, silent space that many mistake for apathy or depression. Here lies the first great challenge: to face this lack of drive as a spiritual phenomenon, not a personal failure. You're not failing because you've lost motivation. You're being emptied of everything that wasn't truly you. But since no one prepares us for this emptying, it's almost always experienced with guilt, anguish, and confusion. After all, we grew up believing motivation equals life. And when it's gone, we think, what's wrong with me? Nothing's wrong. What's happening is a deep and silent process of dismantling. Your soul, realizing the old motivations were fragile and illusory, begins the patient and inevitable work of tearing down the internal structures that upheld your identity. You stop chasing recognition, productivity, external success, not because you no longer care, but because you finally see that none of it ever defined who you are. And this insight, though liberating, creates a peculiar kind of paralysis. If I'm not that, then what am I? This question echoes in the silence of the collapse. It's an uncomfortable pause, because the ego was trained to move, to act, to conquer. Suddenly, the machinery stops. What was automatic becomes improbable. What used to get you out of bed now seems pointless. But within this apparent discouragement lies the most sacred potential, the birth of a new motivation, one that doesn't stem from fear or need, but from truth and presence. The invisible collapse is a spiritual rite of passage. There's no way to cross awakening without going through it. And most importantly, it's not a sign of regression or illness. It's a sign of evolution, even if in a way society doesn't recognize. Society values movement, action, productivity. The spirit, however, values silence, integration, and truth. And it's precisely here that your soul begins to prepare for a new way of existing. From here, the journey will no longer be driven by the anxiety to do, but by the call to be. The collapse isn't the end of your motivation, but the end of false motivation. It's the start of a more mature, quieter, more real process. And though you may only perceive the emptiness now, it's within this emptiness that a new strength is being forged. A strength that doesn't feed on external pressures, but on a deep alignment with who you are, without masks, without performance, without the need for applause. Few talk about this, but it's real. When you awaken spiritually, there's an unspoken expectation that finally, everything will make sense. That you'll wake up every day with unwavering clarity, a burning purpose, a new energy, that the whole world will notice. As if, after all the effort and suffering, you deserve this explosion of motivation. But in practice, what arrives is silence. No victory music, no applause. Just a quiet, strange inner space you don't know how to inhabit. Maybe you felt this after realizing profound truths about yourself and life. What used to drive you no longer works. The plans you made, the goals that seemed so important, suddenly lose their pull. You see you spent years chasing things that no longer make sense. But at the same time, you don't know what to replace them with. And this not knowing hurts, because we're used to acting, producing, always having a next step. Buddhist teachings speak extensively about this, the process of emptying the self. When we start to understand that much of what we did was driven by illusory desires born of fear and attachment, naturally, the will to continue fades. Not because life has lost value, but because what moved our life wasn't true. The Buddha taught that desire is a cause of suffering. And when we begin to see this, desire quiets, but with it, so does the old motivation. This absence of motivation can be disorienting. You look at yourself and no longer recognize who you are. What once excited you now feels empty, forced, and you wonder, what's wrong with me? The answer is nothing. There's nothing wrong. You're simply going through a transition that wasn't meant to be comfortable, but necessary. You're leaving behind the old way of living, but haven't yet found the new. And this interval is silent, long, and often lonely. Buddhism also speaks of the state of non-action, a space where the being learns to simply be, without compulsively needing to do. Perhaps this is the moment you're living, and perhaps this is the hardest lesson. How to remain present even without grand projects, dreams, or motivations. How to exist fully when there's nothing grandiose to do, when everything feels so simple, so still. This silence, which at first seems like a flaw, is actually an invitation. An invitation to hear what was never heard, because the noise of the search was too loud. An invitation to look within, without the rush to get anywhere. What you're living isn't apathy, weakness, or spiritual failure. It's the space where the old identity dissolves, and the new one doesn't yet have a name. It's uncomfortable, because we were taught that being motivated equals being alive. But true spirituality teaches that there is life in silence, in pause, in stillness too. And perhaps now, the greatest act of courage you can muster is exactly this. Not chasing anything, not trying to force a new motivation, but simply accepting that in this moment, the most sacred thing isn't doing, it's being. Being present in the discomfort, in the absence of meaning, until naturally, a new way of moving through life emerges. Not because you need it, but because something true, silent, and profound invites you. There's a space almost no one talks about, the one where you can no longer believe in the old motivations, but haven't yet found a new way to exist. It's not a comfortable or glamorous space. It's silent, raw, uneasy. You no longer identify with the ego that once ran your life, but you also don't yet fully feel the soul as your guide. It's a strange crossing where everything feels suspended, undefined. In this space, you realize the old identity, the one that did, achieved, presented itself to the world, is slowly dying. It's not a quick process. There's no specific day when you wake up and say, "There, I'm transformed." In fact, it's so subtle, you only notice when you no longer recognize yourself. Clothes, tastes, relationships, habits, everything seems left behind, but you don't yet know what will take their place. Buddhism calls this state the middle way, not in a moral sense, but as a space of suspension, where you're no longer bound to the old, but haven't yet embodied the new. It's the space of radical impermanence, where everything that once gave security dissolves, and there are no solid new forms to lean on yet. And that's exactly why many people, upon reaching this point, fall into crisis. There's no ground, no clear direction, no certainty. This is the territory of the void, and it's profoundly human. Everyone who walks an authentic spiritual path passes through it, though not always consciously. Contrary to what the ego fears, the void isn't a place of destruction, but of gestation. What feels like absence is, in fact, the necessary space for something new and truer to emerge. But the ego, used to filling every void with distractions, fights desperately against this state. You may notice this struggle in the urge to fill the space with anything: a new project, a new relationship, a new goal. But if you have the courage not to give in, you'll see that the void doesn't want to be filled. It wants to be respected. It wants to be inhabited. It's in this silence that the soul slowly begins to find space to emerge, not as another identity, but as a more authentic and profound expression of your being. This in-between space is uncomfortable because it doesn't offer the quick answers we're used to seeking. There are no clear signs, no guarantees, only the raw experience of being between worlds, the world you already knew and the one that hasn't yet been born. Paradoxically, it's exactly this not knowing that allows something truly new to arise. As Buddhist masters say, it's only when the bowl is empty that it can be filled again. Being in this space is therefore a call to patience, humility, and surrender. There's nothing to do but hold yourself in it with presence and compassion. Don't rush, don't force, don't flee, just be. Because in this territory of the void, something invisible is being prepared, a new way of living, more aligned, truer, freer. And this form will only emerge when you fully accept that for now, there's no one you need to be, only who you're becoming. We live in a culture that idolizes movement, productivity, and constant progress. From a young age, we're taught that value lies in those who do, who achieve, who never stop. Silence, pause, waiting. These are seen as failures, signs of weakness, or even laziness. So when a spiritual awakening leads us to silence, to the empty space where there's no immediate motivation, it's natural to feel not just discomfort, but shame. We're conditioned to feel guilt for not doing something. This conditioning pushes us, almost automatically, to try to fill the void with new courses, new projects, new goals, new relationships. The market knows this and offers endless options for those who can't stand to pause. Productivity formulas, motivation hacks, personal growth challenges. But none of this meets the real need of the moment. Because what the soul is asking for isn't more movement. It's permission for silence, for non-doing. The paradox is that the more we try to escape this space, the larger it grows. It's as if the soul says, "No use distracting me. I'm here, waiting for you to listen." But listening requires stopping. And stopping, in our society, feels like an act of rebellion. We live in a time that doesn't tolerate the authentic spiritual process because it doesn't fit the patterns of productivity and success imposed on us. Spiritual silence, this sacred interval, is often misinterpreted as stagnation or failure. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that attachment is suffering. And curiously, we're attached to the idea that we're only valuable if we're producing, acting, visibly progressing. This attachment keeps us from seeing that there are other movements, invisible, internal ones, that happen in pause, in withdrawal, in listening. But today's culture doesn't value this kind of movement because it's not measurable, doesn't generate status, doesn't make headlines. When you cross this silent space after awakening, you feel this conflict firsthand. On one side, the soul asking for pause, withdrawal, emptying. On the other, the world demanding action, answers, results. And between these two poles, anguish arises. Am I doing something wrong? No, you're not doing anything wrong. You're doing exactly what your soul needs. pausing. What's wrong is the societal model that doesn't prepare us for this kind of experience. The silence that culture fears is, in truth, a state of potency. It's in this space that new ways of being are gestated, old wounds are healed, and new motivations, more aligned with truth, can emerge. But since no one teaches us to trust this process, we end up feeling inadequate, as if we're wasting time or squandering life, when in reality, we're simply allowing life to unfold at a different rhythm, the rhythm of the soul, not of society. Recognizing this is liberating. Understanding that there's nothing wrong with not being in a hurry, not having a plan, not knowing the next step, is one of the greatest spiritual achievements. Because in this recognition, you detach from the need to prove your worth through what you do, and begin to accept that your worth lies in what you are. And this is the first sign that a new way of living is approaching, quieter, truer, more at peace. When motivation vanishes after a spiritual awakening, it's common to think something went wrong, that there was a glitch in the process, that you lost your way, or that you're regressing. But nothing could be further from the truth. What you're experiencing isn't a mistake, but a fundamental stage of the spiritual journey, the process of dissolution. It's not a personal failure, but a silent initiation, a necessary preparation for a new version of you to emerge. Dissolution happens because the internal system that drove you until now, made of beliefs, fears, ambitions, and identities, no longer serves. And like any true renewal, the old must first completely fall away. What you're living then is a kind of symbolic death, the end of the old structure of motivation, of the identity built from external expectations. And like any death, it brings pain, uncertainty, and silence. Buddhist teachings remind us that everything is subject to impermanence. Nothing remains fixed, not even what we think is our personality, our desires, or our purposes. This teaching, often repeated, is only truly understood when we experience, in practice, the collapse of the motivations we once defined as ours. Realizing that even what we thought was us can dissolve is at once terrifying and liberating. This process is called by many a spiritual initiation because it marks a transition, the end of the conditioned self and the beginning of a truer approach to the essential self. But this passage isn't made with lights or certainties. It's made in the dark, in silence, in absolute vulnerability. What dissolves is everything you thought you needed to be. What hasn't yet arisen is who you are, without needing to define yourself. And this space is exactly the space of initiation, the in-between. That's why the absence of motivation shouldn't be seen as a symptom of failure, but as a sign that the process is working, that the soul is, in fact, refusing to keep feeding the old impulses to make room for what's true. The pain isn't from the lack of motivation itself, but from trying to keep alive what's already dead. Suffering comes from resistance, not dissolution. When you accept the process, suffering begins to give way to presence. This dissolution process is, paradoxically, a great act of love from your soul to you. It's the refusal to keep participating in a life that no longer represents you. It's the way your essence found to say, I don't want to keep going on autopilot, in performance, in endless pursuit. And by withdrawing, it creates the necessary space for a new way of living, more aligned with who you really are, to be born. But this birth, like all births, requires time and trust. When you start to see that it's not failure, but initiation, your relationship with the process changes. Anxiety gives way to surrender, fear to curiosity. And slowly, you begin to notice you're being rebuilt, not from what the world expects of you, but from what your soul quietly whispers. This is the true reconfiguration, when life starts being driven not by the ego that wants to be seen, but by the soul that wants to be lived. After crossing the dissolution of old motivation, a new possibility emerges, still fragile, still silent, but profoundly transformative. It's when you start to realize you no longer need to move to prove something, to be accepted, or to meet expectations. The motivation that once came from need now begins to arise from presence, no longer an urge to do, but an invitation to simply be. And this being is enough. This new motivation is radically different from what accompanied you until now. It doesn't shout. It doesn't pressure. It doesn't demand. It whispers. It comes as a gentle urge to express, to create, to connect, not to gain validation, but because not acting would be a betrayal of your own essence. It's no longer about chasing an ideal, but responding to an inner call that, for the first time, feels true. Buddhism speaks of acting without attachment to the outcome. This is the principle guiding the new motivation, doing not because you need a result, but because the action itself is an expression of your being. When you start to experience this kind of motivation, you notice it's lighter, more fluid, more sustainable. It doesn't demand Herculean effort or inhuman sacrifices. It simply flows, like a natural extension of your presence in the world. You had to strive, plan, and prove yourself. But now, life starts moving more spontaneously, almost like a dance. You feel the impulse, and you respond. You feel the desire, and you act. There's no longer that constant tension between who you are and what you need to do. Instead, there's a more harmonious, more integrated flow. It's important to realize that this new motivation doesn't mean a lack of action. On the contrary, often you'll act more, create more, and serve more. But now the source is different. No longer fear, no longer lack, no longer the desire to be seen. What moves you now is a deep connection to what's true within you. And this connection generates a serene, stable strength that doesn't burn out easily because it doesn't depend on external circumstances. This is the moment you begin to see that life is no longer a stage where you perform for applause, but a space where you simply are, where you live as who you came here to be. Motivation becomes a reflection of your essence, not an artifice created by the ego. And when this shift happens, action becomes light, presence becomes full, and life stops being a battle. It turns into a spontaneous expression of your being. This is the true spiritual rebirth, when, after losing all the old motivations, you begin to move from something much deeper and more authentic. You act not because you need to, but because you want to, not from fear of rejection, but from the joy of sharing who you truly are. At this point, life transforms. It is no longer driven by obligation, but guided by the quiet joy of being aligned with your truth. Getting here wasn't easy. You had to endure the collapse of the old motivations, the discomfort of the void, and resist the temptation to fill the silence with distractions. And now, you're beginning to see that there is another way to live, not based on performance, validation, or the need to prove something, but rooted in alignment with your own soul. This way of living is profoundly liberating. Living from alignment means your choices, your actions, and even your silences are no longer dictated by others' expectations, but by what makes sense to you. It is a movement that flows from the inside out, not the other way around. Before, you lived reacting to the world's demands. Now, you respond to the call of your soul. And this response is quieter, more loving, and truer to who you are. Buddhism reminds us that true freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's not being a slave to the impulses and desires that pull you away from your essence. Living from alignment is just that. Choosing consciously, acting with presence, accepting with serenity. It doesn't mean you won't face challenges, doubts, or pain. But now, you have an inner foundation that sustains your path, and that foundation is fidelity to your own soul. As you begin to live this way, many of your old motivations dissolve. The desire to be admired transforms into a desire to feel whole. The need for success becomes a wish to serve and contribute. The fear of failure is replaced by a willingness to experiment, to grow, to be vulnerable. You no longer live to maintain an image, but to express an essence. And this shift changes everything. Living from alignment also means accepting that there won't always be grand goals or objectives to chase. Sometimes, the most aligned thing you can do is simply be. To feel, to rest, to contemplate. Action stops being compulsive and becomes intentional. You no longer run to achieve something, but move when you feel a real call, a genuine invitation from life. In that movement, there is peace, truth, and freedom. This is the point where motivation transforms forever. It is no longer a frantic impulse demanding results. It becomes a quiet, stable, lasting force that guides you gently. It doesn't burn out because it doesn't depend on applause or external validation. It is motivation born of being, not doing, and that is the purest, most sustainable way to live. Realizing this, you begin to see that your spiritual awakening was not a loss, but a gift. It wasn't the end of your motivation, but its transmutation. Now, you inhabit life with more wholeness, more presence, and more authenticity. Perhaps, for the first time, you no longer need to desperately search outside yourself because what you were seeking was always within. Living from this awareness is the soul's final call, not to do more, but to simply be. The greatest challenge in this process may not be the absence of motivation, but the difficulty of remaining in this space without self-blame, without forcing, without rushing what can only unfold in the soul's time. The most valuable advice I can offer is this: cultivate patience with tenderness. Patience isn't passivity, it's wisdom. It's understanding that some inner processes cannot be rushed, just as a seed cannot be forced to sprout before its time. Crossing this period of dissolution requires trust, and trust is built through the daily practice of noticing that, even without grand actions, you are still transforming. Even if you don't yet see it, something is moving within you, just like in winter, when nature seems asleep. But beneath the soil, roots are growing, strengthening, preparing to bloom. This is your soul's time, an underground, silent, yet utterly necessary season. A powerful tool to support this crossing is silent meditation, not to chase elevated states, but simply to sit with what is, without judgment, without needing to change anything. Meditation in this moment isn't about reaching enlightenment. It's about cultivating presence within the void. It's about sitting with the absence of motivation and gently asking, "What do you want to show me?" That listening is a profound act of spiritual courage. Another essential practice is self-compassion. Treat yourself as you would someone you love deeply who is going through a difficult time, with kindness, respect, and patience. Let go of the idea that you should be more productive, more motivated, or clearer. Accept that, right now, the most spiritual thing you can do is care for yourself with gentleness. Self-compassion isn't indulgence. It is spiritual maturity. It's recognizing the difficulty of the process and allowing yourself to be human in the midst of it. Also, understand that this state isn't permanent. Though it may feel like motivation has vanished forever, it will return, but in a different form, more aligned, gentler, and truer. The key is to trust the process, to believe that your soul knows what it's doing, even when your mind doesn't understand. Trust isn't certainty. It's moving forward even in uncertainty. It's walking through the dark with faith that, eventually, the light will shine from within. During this phase, avoid comparisons. Don't measure yourself against others in different rhythms, stages, or experiences. The spiritual journey isn't linear, and each soul has its own timing and unique way of crossing the void. Comparing yourself only breeds disconnection and anguish. Honor your path, even when it feels stuck, even when it feels too quiet. Sometimes, the greatest movement happens when everything seems still. And always remember, you're not alone. Though this process is rarely spoken of, many have walked through it. Many more will. You're part of a silent lineage of souls who chose to live more authentically, more aligned, and more truthfully. That choice takes great courage. So honor your journey, embrace your crossing, and know the void that now feels frightening will one day be remembered as the fertile ground where your new life began to bloom. If you've made it this far, know this: there's nothing wrong with you. The absence of motivation wasn't failure, weakness, or regression. It was a silent invitation from your soul to leave behind the old structures that no longer serve you. You didn't lose your motivation. You're becoming someone who only moves when the movement is true. And that is one of the greatest spiritual achievements of all. Now, you understand the vast difference between acting out of obligation and acting from alignment, between moving to be accepted and moving because your soul is calling. Few have the courage to cross this process to the end. Many stop halfway or try to go back. But you, by being here, show a rare willingness. The willingness not to flee from yourself. And that is true awakening. Not the one that makes you run, but the one that teaches you to pause, to listen, and to trust. If this message touched you, like this video, not as a habit, but as a symbol that you are ready to live more authentically, more presently, and more aligned with your soul. Subscribe to the channel to walk with others on this same path. And in the comments, write with courage, "I'm ready to live aligned with my soul." Let this be your new promise to yourself. Always remember, the path is not about speed or quantity or performance. The path is about presence, truth, and love. There is no rush. There is no demand. There is only life, asking to be lived with wholeness. And you are ready for that, even if you can't yet fully see it. Thank you for making it this far, for trusting your journey, and above all, for trusting yourself. Your crossing is necessary. Your listening is courageous, and your presence is, and always will be, enough. Until our next meeting, always at the right time, always in the truest space, the awakened heart.